not so Lenten classic, praying for Michael Jackson. I wonder if Ray Ray knows that Michael's passed. But we can still pray for Michael. We always need to pray for Michael. Always. Definitely. So we are in week 3 of Lent. And the sacred story that Bob read for us puts us quite a bit of ways along the story of the gospel. We are just about halfway through, and a lot of things have happened prior to the part of the story in which Bob read for us today. Jesus has been teaching, he's been healing, he's been exorcising demons, he has been performing miracles, and some of our favorite Jesus things have happened prior to this episode, this experience that Jesus has with the Pharisees today. These are some of the things that we absolutely love about Jesus, and probably one of the reasons why we might consider ourselves a Jesus-type person. He has, in this time, he has been teaching people about how to experience God in their lives. He has healed people. He's seen blind people along the road, and he has been moved with compassion for them, and he's taken mud or dirt and spit on it, made it mud, and put it on their eyes, and when he wipes it away, they can see again. He has walked on water. He has calmed a storm. He has taken 5 fish and 2 loaves, and he's broken them and fed 5,000 people. He has confronted Legion and exorcised the man who Legion was consuming, and has set him free from that unclean spirit. These are some of our favorite Jesus stories. And they find themselves constantly being brought up in the mainline church, year in, year out. Sometimes every year, some of these stories are being told to our people in the pews. Jesus has even been transfigured. He has gone up onto the mountaintop with 3 of his favorite disciples, and they've had the ecstatic moment of the clouds parting, the ray of light coming down upon him, and yet again hearing that voice from God saying, "This is my son, my beloved." And then he comes down from the mountain, and he sees a parent whose child is on the verge of death. And he is so moved with compassion for the love that this parent has for their child that he takes the child and he removes it from the brink of passing over into that life beyond life and heals it, to the great joy and acclamation and adoration of that parent. So some of our favorite things have happened prior to us hearing our sacred story this morning. And he's made that move towards Jerusalem. He had been hanging out in Galilee and northern Judea, but now he has made the turn towards Jerusalem. And that is not only a historical fact, it's also a metaphorical truth that things are about to get hard for Jesus. Dark days are ahead. As our days are getting lighter and lighter, Jesus' days are getting darker and darker. And then, prior to what we hear today in chapter 11, because this is at the very end of the chapter, some of our favorite Jesus stories are at the beginning of chapter 11. He teaches his disciples when they ask him, "We want to be able to pray. Teach us how to pray." He teaches them what we call the Lord's Prayer, which, of course, we spent 4 weeks learning and dissecting and trying to figure out what the meaning of that is. He exorcises yet again another demon from a man who then is able to reassociate and reconnect with his community. And then right prior to this, the very beginning of the story goes, and Jesus was teaching. And what he was teaching right before this event happens with the Pharisees and the lawyers is he does this beautiful exposition on the metaphor of light. That each and every one of us has a spark of light, a divine spark, a God-like spark in our lives. And we are all called to be light for people who are going through dark days. And this is where we get that wonderful children's song that so many of us love to sing. "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine." Jesus just basically taught them that song prior to this. So some of our favorite Jesus stuff that we hear constantly over and over again has just happened. And then a Pharisee invites Jesus to dinner. And honestly, at this point, no one should invite Jesus to dinner. He is such a horrible dinner guest. He constantly, consistently just chastises the people who have opened their doors and put a place around their table for him. Honestly, there should be a picture on everyone's door that says, "Do not serve this man." He does this to Mary, his own mother, who, God bless her, she stays with him to the bitter end, even though he is incredibly mean to her on more than one occasion. He does this to Mary and Martha. He does this to a number of Pharisees, and yet they keep inviting him. Why? Why do they keep inviting him to dinner? So these Pharisees have come to see Jesus because he's pretty popular at this point. He's got a couple of hundred people who are following him around on a consistent basis. Not just the 12, not just the 70, but a couple hundred. He's starting to make waves. And these Pharisees, whoever they are, these nameless Pharisees, have come to check on him because he is doing some things in which they might call into question. But let's stop right there for a moment because I want to talk to you a little bit about Pharisees. Because that's one of those biblical words which most of us have no idea what that word means. It has come in common parlance to sort of be an equivalent synonym for hypocrite. But who were the Pharisees in the first century? These people, these guys who Jesus keeps encountering, and the Gospels seem to have some pretty negative things to say. Well, thank you, Bob. They were not lawyers in like what we think of 21st century lawyers, but what they were, any Jewish boy could train to be a Pharisee. And one of the numbers that I saw around that was happening by the end of the Pharisaic movement in the late 2nd century, there could have been somewhere between 4,000 to 6,000 Pharisees running around in the greater Israel, Palestine area of the Middle East. And what they were is after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Babylonians and the dispersal of the Jewish people in the Babylonian exile, and then they were freed to come back to their homeland and to build the second temple. Two major groups, political, social, and religious groups, grew out of them. One was the Sadducees, and their core and their existence revolved around the temple in Jerusalem. These are the people that when you came to the temple on a festival would be holding the festival and doing the sacrifices and saying the prayers. But that was located only in Jerusalem. The second group were the Pharisees, which located their center and focus around the local synagogue. The temple would take care of the major festivals, the big parties, if you will, the big celebrations, the major sacrifices. But the day in, day out religious life of Jewish people in the first century was handled in the synagogue, and Pharisees were dedicated to the life of the synagogue. And what Pharisees were tremendously concerned with was a person's adherence and the relationship to God. And the way that Pharisees felt that you could keep a right relationship with God was to follow the law of Moses. One of the ways to sort of boil this down into one word is to say, Jackie, you want to have right relationship with God? You should follow the law of Moses. And if you want to really know what that means, I can boil it down to you in one word. Behave. We all know she's going to fail at that. We all know Jackie. There's no way she's going to actually follow that. But because the law could be somewhat esoteric, the Pharisees decided that they needed to help people be in right relationship with God through following the law of Moses. And so one of the things that Pharisees ended up doing, for all the right reasons, was take the one biblical law and mandate that says, keep the Sabbath day holy. Well, how do you do that? The Pharisees came up with ways, sometimes a very detailed list of ways in which you could keep the Sabbath holy depending on your circumstance and what day it was and what you're trying to do. And so you're not only trying to keep the 10 commandments or the 300 commandments, or I actually made sure I was correct with this with Dr. Fuller earlier this morning, or the over 600 commandments and trying to keep all of those consistently and consecutively. But now there was detailed lists. So you could be really trying to keep and behave by keeping a lot of things in your mind so that you, Jackie, would behave. But what the Pharisees were trying to do was to keep people in right relationship with God and with each other and with their community. But they were much like the first century NCAA, where there was just one code after another, another law, another example, another thing that you had to keep so that you would not get fined. But the Pharisees were not this evil, bad, hypocritical group in sort of carte blanche. What they were Jesus' peers, his colleagues, his friends. Because I have said on a number of occasions already through this Lent that Jesus was a good Jewish boy raised in a good Jewish family, and we read last week in the Gospel of Luke that Jesus went to synagogue on the Sabbath day as was his custom. You know who else's custom it was to go to synagogue on the Sabbath day? Pharisees. These are the people sitting next to Jesus in the synagogue pew. These are his friends. These are the people that are his peers. They can sit and talk and debate. These are the very people that Jesus is trying to emulate and to raise and to be concerned with. And not only were the Pharisees his peers, but we know some of the Pharisees ended up being his disciples. Gospel of John tells us Nicodemus. We know that one Pharisee in particular in the first century, Gamaliel, was a huge proponent and an advocate for the relationship between Judaism and early Christianity. And when Herod finally got done with John, and he started to turn his attention to Jesus, it was a couple of Pharisees who came to Jesus and said, "Watch out, Herod is after you." But they both had the same goal. How can we keep people in right relationship with God? How can we build a good relationship with God and community and this good, blessed, wonderful earth? So the Pharisees invite Jesus to dinner. And Jesus doesn't wash his hands. That's gross. That's gross in the 21st century. It's super gross in the first century. And that was a direct violation of the law. And I'm not even talking about the other detailed laws that the Pharisees came up with to detail how you could keep the law. I mean, it's right there in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible. That's a direct violation. Jesus did that. He didn't wash his hands. And when the Pharisees looked at each other and went that's gross. Because you're going to be touching the food that we're going to be touching. Instead of Jesus saying, "I'm sorry, you're right, I'm a good Jew, I should go and wash my hands before I eat this meal," he does what? He turns it on him and he goes, "Whoa! Woe to you Pharisees." And when they're partners in crime, the lawyer said, "Hey, Jesus, when you woe them, you're kind of woeing us too." He was like, "You want some of that woe? Woe to you too, lawyers." This is what I mean. Why do you invite Jesus to dinner? He's a horrible guest. This was in a direct violation of the law, which Jesus just does so often. He breaks Sabbath law. He touches lepers. He invites outsiders. He's constantly needling and poking the Pharisees. And the Pharisees in the room take note of this. But like Pharisee, we have sort of a misrepresentation of what woe is as well. So I want to take a moment to talk to you a little bit about woe. Woe has three kind of basic understandings to it. One of them comes to us from our very good friend Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a dramatic man. And in the gospel, or in the prophecy of Jeremiah, Many times Jeremiah talks about the woe that has come upon him. One of the ways to think about woe in the personal sense and have a state of woe-ness about you is to be in a state of distress or misery. We all got those friends that you call up and you're like, hey, how's it going? And you know what you want to hear? Good, fine. But instead they immediately go, I'm miserable. Which you want to hear, but maybe not the very first thing out of their mouth. And that's what woe is in the Jeremiah sense of the word. It is distress, it's misery. It's very dramatic, and there's no filter, and they're just letting all of you have everything that's inside of them coming at you. So that's the first experience of woe. The second one is, woe is the opposite of blessing. Blessed are the peacemakers, the widows, the orphan, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness' sake. And blessedness in that sense can be really summed up in God's favor. It's not that your life is going to be easier, better, but God smiles upon you when you're a peacemaker, when you've lost your children, lost your spouse, lost your parents, when you're trying to do well by thirsting for justice and peace in the world, while people are persecuting you. It might not feel good at the moment, but know that God smiles upon you. There's a special place in God's heart for you. Woe is the opposite of that. It's God's disfavor. It's not if you do these things, you won't be successful, won't be happy, won't have a great life. It's just that God sort of frowns upon it and doesn't really have a special place in your heart for that behavior. Behave. The last one, which is what I think Jesus is trying to do, is a sort of declaration of future judgment. It's an if-then statement. Woe becomes an if-then. If you continue to do this, then when the time comes, God will judge you harshly. And Jesus is telling the Pharisees, this behavior, these things, this adherence, strict adherence to the law, you're missing the point altogether. And if you continue along this path, God is not going to bless this. Jesus is not just taking pot shots at his friends and his colleagues, his peers. He is deeply concerned for their well-being. He is deeply concerned that they're missing the point in what they're trying to do and trying to keep people in right relationship with God. And he wants them to see the errors of their ways. Woe, Pharisees. Woe, lawyers. If you continue along this path, you're not going to have the outcome you're looking for. And so, in great sort of Jewish fashion, Jesus sends 6 woes to the Pharisees and the lawyers, and on the 7th, he rests. And 3 of the woes are aimed at the Pharisees, and 3 of the woes are aimed at the lawyers. And these are what you can basically sum these up as. Instead of just getting up and washing his hands and saying, you're right, I should probably keep the law and wash my hands, Jesus uses the opportunity to send these woes against the Pharisees, that they care more about their legal details, about all of that detailed ways of keeping the Sabbath and following the law of Moses, than they actually care about performing and living out God's love and justice in the world. They are a slave to the law. They are idolaters to policy and procedure. And what they really ought to care about, Jesus says, is living God's love and peace and justice in the world. The second woe is that they love them some Pharisee. Pharisees love them some Pharisees, and they have this great deal of self-pride, and they love all the attention that Jesus says that they get in the community. I like to think of this one as the clergy rule. There are a lot of us, a lot of priests and ministers and pastors and rabbis and imams, that this can be intoxicating. All of you staring at me, listening intently, coming week in and week out, giving me 20 minutes to talk about whatever I want to. When things are going wrong, you call me. all of a sudden I can think of myself as a pretty important person. This is what Jesus is telling them. Guard against that pride. And don't think that that attention is really for you. Be careful. Whoa, Daryl. The last one is that they are actually perpetuating the problem. That they think they're trying to get out of this cycle of sin and redemption, sin and redemption, sin and redemption. But because they've made it so difficult for people to behave, they're actually perpetuating the problem. And so then when the Pharisees, Robin, to their Batman says, whoa, 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 Jesus, come on now, be nice. We're feeding you. Jesus says, well, I got something for you too, lawyers. The first woe against the lawyers I like to call the Nixon rule. They feel like they are exempt from following the very laws that Moses has laid down. The Nixon rule, remember that, don't you? It's not illegal if the president does it. It's not against the law if a lawyer does it. It's not against the law of Moses if a Pharisee does it. The second woe I call the MLK rule. The lawyers love to honor the prophets that come before them, but they have no interest whatsoever in actually adhering to the advice and the prophecy and the laws and the way to live their lives that the prophets actually teach people to do. You know, like we do every MLK Sunday, where we listen to the I Have a Dream speech and we climb up on Dr. King's lap like he's a black Santa Claus and tell him how we all want peace in the world, but we actually have no interest whatsoever ourselves to actually do anything about it. It's what I call the Dr. King woe. And then the last woe is the woe which I call the San Diego City Council woe. It's being so out of touch with the actual needs of the community and that they actually would rather deal with other things that aren't really that important. It's what I like to call, we have a serious homeless issue in our city, and yet our city council is infinitely more concerned with talking about how we can bring a new sports franchise to our city. No one cares. We should be talking about how to deal with our serious homeless problem. Woe to you, San Diego City Council. So I want to conclude with a really great question, I think. Why would Luke put this in his gospel? Why is it in there? Why would Luke include this? He obviously thought it was important. Is it simply that he wants to dance on the graves of Pharisees? Is it simply just to give us an historical account of how Jesus taught and dealt with people and his peers and his colleagues? Our lectionary, those people who create the progressive mainline tradition of which what scripture verses should be read on Sunday morning, do not include this story in it. They don't want us to read the woes of Jesus. They want us to think about walking on water and healing people and calming the storm and feeding people through loaves and fishes. They don't want us to hear about woes. It's not in there. You can come to church every Sunday for 3 years and never hear this story. So why does Luke include this episode? I don't think it's in there to be a condemnation of Pharisaic Judaism. Or worse, what some of my colleagues have done, to make it a condemnation of Judaism and any non-Christian tradition altogether. That is an anti-Semitic way of reading this scripture verse, and we need to make sure we guard against that. But I do think what Luke is trying to do is make sure that the church understands that these woes aren't against the Pharisees, but these woes are for us. If we continue to be more concerned with legal details, policies and procedures, bylaws, than we are about God's love and justice, woe to us. If we love ourselves some us, woe to us. If we are perpetuating the problem of making it more difficult for people to break out of the cycle of sin and redemption, woe to us. If we think we are exempt from following these ways of love and justice and peace, woe to us. If we honor our prophets but have no desire whatsoever to actually heed their warnings and live their ways, woe to us. And if we are completely out of touch with our community and that is around us, then woe to us. We are called to model our communal life and our individual lives on Christ. And I know if you're like me, it can be hard to live it. So if we're going to err, let's not err on legalism and hypocrisy. Let's err on the side of love and grace and compassion and justice. Let us continually be re-evaluating how we can be more Christ-like and restrain against the very real and prevalent sin of thinking that these woes are not meant for us. It's hard teaching. Like Mark says, sometimes it's hard to hear and hard to get started. But they're truly meant for us to remember that the opposite of woe is blessing, to have God's favor. And we receive that, not when we dig into the legalism of our community, but when we throw open the doors and make it as welcoming as we possibly can. And we live the beatitudes of the blessings of Christ. And we don't think of ourselves first, forget the needs of our community, disregard our prophets, think better of ourselves than what we truly are, or think in any way, shape, or form like these poor Pharisees, who all they did was invite Jesus to dinner. It's our own fault. We invite him every week. Amen.